Okay, here's today's list of heroes and saints. We'll hear about the fall of the Roman Empire and about Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who became the first important king rather than emperor of Italy, and who murdered his predecessor and tortured his own prime minister to death, and yet is regarded as one of the most enlightened men of the age, which tells you something about the age. Boethius was his unfortunate prime minister, who was also arguably the last great classical scholar and the author of a couple of real medieval bestsellers. Justinian is going to transiently unite Italy to the Eastern Roman Empire and build Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. After the break, we'll hear about Gregory I, Gregory the Great, who's given credit, of course, for the style of liturgical music called Gregorian chant. And we'll hear about Saint Benedict, who's given credit for definitively establishing organized Christian monasticism in the West. Then we'll move north to hear about the Franks, from Clovis, usually considered the first king of France, properly so called, to Pepin the Short, the father of Charlemagne, who will be one of our main subjects next time. So last week we heard about how the emperor Theodosius divided the Roman Empire between his sons. Arcadius got the east to rule from Constantinople, and Honorius got the west to rule, and ignoring both Rome and Milan, he established the imperial residence in Ravenna, which was regarded as a safe place with its moat of swamps. In 425, he was succeeded in office there after some confusion by his nephew Valentinian III, who had a character much like his own inglorious personality. Because of its protected location and the respect shown it by some later emperors, conquerors, and good luck, Ravenna still has some fine 5th and 6th century buildings, about as many as are to be found in any city anywhere. This is the Neon or Orthodox or Cathedral Baptistry, the oldest important building in Ravenna. It's called the Neon Baptistry after Neon, who was Bishop of Ravenna when it received its mosaic decoration around 450, although the building itself was built some 50 years earlier in the reign of Honorius. It's called the Orthodox Baptistry, not because it has anything to do with what we think of today as Eastern Orthodoxy, but rather because it served the mainstream Christian community that accepted the Nicene Creed, as opposed to the Arians, the unorthodox, who had their own baptistry across town and did not accept the creed. Its very plain brickwork is typical of late imperial buildings. We saw the same thing last time in the baptistry of St. John Lateran in Rome. But inside it is heavily decorated with some of the oldest mosaics in the city. Here you see the interior now. The mosaics in Ravenna are made of crude glass and are very different from the marble chip mosaics of the late Republican and early Imperial period in Rome. The only other example of this kind of thing we've seen was at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which is of more or less the same date. The sculpted figures you see, which probably represent Old Testament heroes, are among the very last in the classical tradition, and it will be over 500 years before we see something comparable to them again. Of about the same date, around 450 or so, is the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, the sister of Honorius, who was the mother of Valentinian III, and who was one of the most interesting people of the age. She was in Rome at the time of its sack by Alaric in 410 and was captured and married, not against her will, to a dashing Visigoth, though that sounds like an oxymoron, I guess, named Ataulf, an ally of Alaric's. Honorius didn't like his sister marrying the friend of someone he regarded as a barbarian terrorist, but she seems to have genuinely loved Ataulf. After he was eventually and inevitably assassinated, Honorius made her marry one of his generals, Constantine, whom she did not love, but by whom she became the mother of Valentinian III, for whom she served as regent after Honorius died in 423, leaving no son himself. And for the rest of her life, she was the most important person in the government of the Western Roman Empire, even after her son grew to maturity. Here you can see the interior of the mausoleum now. There are 3 sarcophagi in it, traditionally said to be those of Galla Placidia, Honorius, and Valentinian III, but that's just speculation. Above are Peter and Paul, and below them St. Lawrence with his gridiron, on which he was roasted by way of achieving martyrdom. And in fact, some people think this place had nothing to do with Galla Placidia and was simply a kind of chapel, perhaps dedicated to St. Lawrence. Virtually no light comes through the thin gypsum windows. If you can call them that. So until the invention of electricity, I don't think it was really ever possible to see these mosaics at their best. Although it is true that by candlelight they might have produced quite an eerie or poetic or maybe spiritual effect. This is a detail from the mosaic decoration here. Valentinian III himself was assassinated in 455, and between him and Romulus Augustulus, the last fellow to claim to be Roman emperor in the West, we have what Gibbon calls a succession of imperial mediocrities. In 476, the young Romulus Augustulus was overthrown by Odoacer, also called Odovaker, apparently a son of one of Attila's generals and king of the Heruli, who were allies of the Scandinavian Goths, and he agreed to call himself just King of Italy and to consider himself a subject in some sense of Zeno, the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. On this map you can see how the barbarian tribes have, by the end of the 5th century, occupied what would be more or less their homelands until the present day. Ferdinand Lowe says the empire fell without a sound, and it must certainly be true that no one noticed any great change in 476 after some 300 years of near-death experiences and temporary resuscitations gradually weakening the organization of the thing that had been the Roman Empire. 476 was just the last straw. Gibbon, notoriously, placed a lot of blame on the Christians for bringing the empire to such a state, but he also says the fall was the inevitable result of immoderate greatness. Lucan said, "In se magna ruunt," big things collapse of themselves, which seems to me to make the same point. Herbert Muller says he's counted 52 different reasons given by various historians for the fall of the Roman Empire. The current favorites, of course, are things like pollution and environmental irresponsibility. I like to argue that, in fact, the question, what caused the fall of the Roman Empire, is less like what caused that building to burn down than it is like what caused Saturday. In other words, it's close to nonsense. It's not a question that's unanswerable because we don't have enough or the right information. It's what we might call logically or metaphysically unanswerable. This is a complex issue, but the bottom line is that there is, I think, no right answer to questions like that. This is a little ivory carving on a ring which represents Theodoric the Ostrogoth. Now, for a while things went all right between Zeno and Constantinople and Odoacer and Ravenna, but Odoacer began to pay less and less attention to him. And finally, Theodoric here was sent by Zeno to get rid of him. And this strikes me as a picture of the perfect barbarian hitman. Theodoric arranged a dinner for Odoacer and his sons, and after dessert killed them all with his own hand. Zeno died before this event, but his successors benefited little from it either, because Theodoric paid no more attention to Constantinople than Odoacer had, and took over as the virtually independent king of Italy. All this makes Theodoric perhaps sound worse than he was, however. He is, in fact, highly regarded for his tolerance, administrative reforms, diplomatic skill, and general humanity. This is the Church of San Apollinare Nuovo now, the oldest surviving church in Ravenna. It was originally founded by Theodoric as the Church of the Redeemer, and it was an Arian church. Theodoric, like so many of those Nouveau Christians from north of the Alps, was one of those who did not accept the Nicene Creed and believed that Jesus was essentially just a man with miraculous powers, not consubstantialum patri, of one substance with God the Father. He was, as I said, tolerant, however, and allowed the Orthodox, the Nicene Christians, to worship in peace as well. Like many of the early churches we saw in Rome last time, this does have the familiar portico in front of a basilica arrangement that was so popular with early Christian architects. Here's the nave inside now. The apse was destroyed in World War II and the marble veneer of the walls was taken in the Renaissance, but the rest of the church is very much as it was in the 6th century. The earliest mosaics are in the very top row and represent the life of Christ. Below them are Old Testament prophets, and below them on the north side, the left side here, is a procession of female saints leading to the adoration of the Magi. And on the south, the right side, we have a procession of male saints leading to Christ enthroned. Despite the Pope's efforts, I might say, to impose Latin as the language of the Christian service, in places like Ravenna, where Byzantine Greek influence was still strong, Greek was still more often used, and some of the earliest examples of Christian liturgical music come from Greek manuscripts written here in Ravenna. The one we're hearing now is Oten to Stavron, the hymn on the crucifixion. And here you can see one of the mosaics from Theodoric's day in the top row at San Apollinare Nuovo. It represents the calling of Andrew and Peter. It's interesting that Jesus is depicted without a beard, although Andrew and Peter look pretty much as they do in later iconography. Here's the miracle of the loaves and fishes with Jesus, Andrew, and Peter again, and the other brothers, James the Greater and John. It's significant that there is no representation of the crucifixion in the church. The early church, especially in the East, preferred the image of Christ enthroned as the ruler of the universe to that of the suffering Savior on the cross, which is rare even in the West until about the 12th century, despite the use of the cross as the Christian symbol. In this picture, you can see the procession on the south side with saints approaching the throne of Christ. This procession was redone in Justinian's day after Ravenna was taken back by his armies, as we'll see later, and the church was changed from an Arian one to a Nicene one around 550. Nicene meaning Orthodox, a church that belonged to those who followed the mainstream papal Roman point of view. And it was renamed then in honor of St. Martin, one of the greatest foes of the Arians, the heretics, and it is Martin who now leads the procession. The church was finally renamed again around 700 when the bones of San Apollinare were moved here from San Apollinare in Classe outside the city. It then became San Apollinare Nuovo, the new, and that is what it's still called today. Jesus here now looks more like his usual self, but what he's holding is a mystery to me. The procession moves from the palace which we see here to the throne of Christ, and probably Theodoric was originally enthroned here, but when Justinian's people took over, he was taken out and replaced by a mosaic curtain. You can actually see someone's hand still sticking out against the column on the left there. There were several important scholars at Theodoric's Ravenna court, including Cassiodorus and Boethius. Cassiodorus made water clocks and sundials and collected a great library of both sacred and classical texts and wrote a 12-volume history of the Goths that unfortunately survives only in an epitome by Jordanes. But it is, that epitome, one of our main sources for the history of the Goths, the Theodoric's people. Although I don't have time to go into why this is so, many scholars think that the picture of the scribe Esdra in the Codex Amiatinus, about which we heard last time, is actually derived from an earlier picture of Cassiodorus in his library at Ravenna. He was also the tutor of Theodoric's grandson and nominal heir, Athalaric. But Boethius is even more important. He became Theodoric's prime minister, but is more famous for having produced translations and summaries in Latin of some of the most important works of Greek philosophy and mathematics, including Euclid's Elements, Aristotle's Organon, the latter, especially the Categories and De Interpretatione from within it, was to be a standard logical textbook for the rest of the Middle Ages. This is a pair of ivory plaques with Boethius on them. He's actually shown here ready to wave a handkerchief to start the chariot races in the Hippodrome, which gives you some idea of the importance given to such events in the 6th century. It's sort of like throwing out the first ball at the World Series, I guess, but as seriously as we take sports, no president has ever been depicted doing this on a stamp. In a bit, we'll hear more about just how seriously the sport, if we can call it that, of chariot racing was taken in the days of Boethius Theodoric and the Emperor Justinian. The main thing for which Boethius remains famous is his philosophical religious treatise called The Consolation of Philosophy, which was a bestseller throughout the Middle Ages and which has probably never been out of print. Unfortunately for Boethius, he had to write it in prison while awaiting execution because he was accused by Theodoric of too close an association with some of the more hardline anti-Arians. Boethius was a Nicene Christian, and Theodoric, remember, was an Arian. Whether Boethius deserved execution or not, and Theodoric later regretted putting him to death, the Consolation is a classic Stoic statement, and Will Durant even says there isn't a line in the work that couldn't have been written by Marcus Aurelius. There's no reference in it to personal immortality, or I think to Jesus or the Gospels. The essence of it is the Stoic point that all manner of fortune is good, and that submission to fate is the key to contentment. This book is a good example of what I've referred to before as the Christian effort to absorb classicism. A Christian wrote what's often considered the last great work of classical philosophy. Boethius was executed in 524, and Theodoric himself died less than 2 years later in 526. This is the tomb of Theodoric outside Ravenna, and Kenneth Clark says it looks like it's fallen here from another planet. The dome is one of the most amazing accomplishments of the age. It was made from a single block of granite weighing 320 tons, and even the Egyptians rarely used stones of that size. It may in fact be the heaviest single block ever used in any building, let alone as the roof of a building. It was quarried across the Adriatic and brought across on a ship especially designed to carry it, but how it got on top of the tomb is something that's still argued about. The Romans had sophisticated compound pulleys. Archimedes is supposed to have made one with which he launched a ship all by himself, so they may well have been used by the engineers here, though some think it was dragged up a ramp or something like that, more in the manner of the pyramid builders. This is another ivory plaque now with Amalasuntha, the only surviving child of Theodoric, on it. She was the mother of his heir Athalaric, just a boy at his grandfather's death. Her mother, Theodoric's wife, was a sister of the Frankish king Clovis, about whom we'll hear more eventually. Amalasuntha's husband left her, and she attempted to rule as regent for the young Athalaric with the assistance of her Frankish relative Theodahad, but he had them both imprisoned and seized the throne himself. She sent a request for help to Justinian in Constantinople, but it was 10 years before any help arrived, and by that time she and Athalaric were both dead and Theodahat himself had been overthrown. You might be surprised at the survival of so many of these apparently delicate ivory works, but ivory is not recyclable like metal. And for a barbarian, there wasn't much satisfaction to be had in just smashing up something like this. Barbarians want to knock down whole buildings. These plaques were also, of course, portable and easily hidden. This is the wall around Constantinople now, built by Theodosius II, the son of Arcadius, just in time to keep Attila and the Huns out in the 5th century. It ran on the west side of the city, 5 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The Emperor Justinian, who took over in Constantinople in 527, is one of the most well-known figures of the early Middle Ages, in part at least because of the surviving work of his biographer Procopius. The latter wrote, in fact, 2 biographies of Justinian, the official one and then the so-called secret history. In the former, Justinian is the image of unsurpassed virtue, and in the latter he is vice personified. Neither can be entirely correct, but the secret history has always been much the more popular and quoted. Gibbon says he prefers it in part because its account is probable, and in part because it's improbable, whatever we're to make of that. Here's a close-up of the mosaic depicting Justinian at San Vitale in Ravenna, which we'll see more of shortly. In the secret history, Procopius says, and I quote, "This emperor was dissembling, crafty, hypocritical, secretive by temperament, two-faced. He was able to shed tears not from any joy or sorrow, but employing them artfully when required, in accordance with immediate need, lying all the time. He was easily led astray into evil ways, but refused every suggestion that he should follow the right path, quick to devise vile schemes and carry them out, and with an instinctive aversion to the mere mention of anything good." Will Durant's comment on that is, well, isn't this what a politician is supposed to be like? Here's the Empress Theodora now, across from her husband Justinian at San Vitale. She was the daughter of a bear trainer in the circus, became an acrobat, and went on to still less respectable jobs. The emperor must have met her, I think, in a place where future emperors shouldn't go. They were married when he was 40 and she was 20, 4 years before he took the throne. Here's what Procopius had to say about her, somewhat edited for a G-rated audience. "There was not a particle of modesty in this little hussy. So far from waiting to be invited by anyone she encountered, she herself, by cracking dirty jokes and wiggling her hips suggestively, would invite all who came her way. Never was anyone so completely given up to unlimited self-indulgence. Often she would go to a bring-your-own dinner party with 10 young men or more, and reduce them all to a state of exhaustion." Procopius does admit, however, that after she became empress, she was a changed woman and a model of imperial virtue. This is a view of the site where the Hippodrome used to be, the Constantinopolitan equivalent to the Circus Maximus in Rome. In Justinian's day, the palace, which was largely still the one Constantine had built, was to the right of the Hippodrome. In the distance is Hagia Sophia now, which at the time would have been the palace chapel built by Theodosius II. The nearer domed building is the much later Blue Mosque. In the center of the Hippodrome stands the so-called obelisk of Constantine in the foreground, and the Egyptian one erected by Theodosius I is in the distance. Between them, in a hole, is what's left of the so-called bronze serpent column erected at Delphi by the Greeks after their victory over the Persians at Plataea in the 5th century BC. This is the floor of the Hippodrome now. As I mentioned a minute ago, racing was taken every bit as seriously in 6th century Constantinople as it had been in 1st century Rome. In fact, partisans of the two main racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, often engaged in brawls and generally threatened the stability of society. In 532, Justinian had some of their leaders arrested, which led to the uniting of the two factions against him as a common enemy of sporting chaos, and the result of this was the so-called Nike or Victory Revolt. Here you can see one of the most famous relics of the Hippodrome in Constantinople, the celebrated quadriga which the Venetian Crusaders of 1204 took home with them, and which stood above the entrance to San Marco until it was moved inside just a few years ago after restoration work on it. It probably decorated the imperial box in Constantinople in the Hippodrome, and some think it was originally part of the decoration of the Circus Maximus in Rome. The caliber of work is thought to argue for the earlier date. We have nothing surviving comparable to it in sculpture within centuries of Justinian's reign. In any case, before Justinian's general Belisarius and the army restored order, the royal palace and chapel had burned down and much else besides. This did, however, give Justinian an opportunity to rebuild them, and he made the most of it. The palace is gone, but Hagia Sophia is still standing as one of the real wonders of the ancient world. Here you can see Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, from the air. Originally a Christian church, of course, it became a mosque in 1453 and was made a secular museum in 1934. The minarets and the Muslim tombs on this side of the building were not, of course, part of the original complex. With Hagia Sophia, at least, if not before, we come to the definitive end of the classical tradition. This looks nothing like any classical building, with the possible exception of the Pantheon, but the latter has a dome on a round building, and Hagia Sophia is essentially square. H.W. Jansen says that Hagia Sophia is in fact the first monumental building to have this arrangement. The architects were Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and they were regarded more as theoretical physicists and mathematicians than as hands-on builders. They may in fact have been chosen by Justinian because he wanted something really cutting edge, not a tried-and-true style, conventional building of the sort more experienced architects might have built. Richard Krautheimer, in fact, says that experienced masons must have been aghast at what these fellows came up with. He says Hagia Sophia defies all the laws of statics and stands only by a miracle. However, Professor Ahmed Lakmak calls it probably the best building ever built, and points out that it has survived 10 major quakes, including a recent one with only relatively minor damage. This is a load-bearing column in the church, which, however, might incline one more to Krautheimer's point of view. Also, Herbert Muller says that everything here is bulging, wavering, and askew, and Hagia Sophia is on the World Monument Watch's list of most endangered sites. Scholars also disagree about the width of the dome, which is a little puzzling. In one edition of his History of Art, Jansen says it's 84 feet wide, and in another he says it's 112. Krautheimer and Durant say 100 feet wide. Nicholas Pevsner says 107, and Gibbon says 115. The official guidebook says it's 101. It's not exactly round, but it's not eccentric enough to account for these differences. Authorities are in more agreement on its height, which is about 183 feet, far higher than the vault of any medieval church ever built in the West. Here it is now at ground level. It was erected in just 5 years, which is probably a record for that kind of thing, but Justinian himself is said to have closely followed the whole project, and employees do tend to work faster when the boss is watching. Since by the time of the great wave of Christian building in the West, Constantinople was regarded as barely a Christian place at all, and was in any case very far away, Hagia Sophia had little influence on medieval building there. Ironically, it was on the other hand one of the most influential buildings in the history of Islamic architecture, especially of course in Constantinople and after the fall of the city to the Muslims in 1453. Here's the entrance to the church. None of the figured mosaics inside are from Justinian's day. If there were any, they were destroyed by the iconoclasts in the 8th century. Most are from the 9th to the 11th century now. Inside, you'll also see the giant Islamic inscriptions, which no one will order removed for fear of something bad happening that would be regarded as a result of this. It is somewhat surprising, in fact, that the Christian mosaics were not destroyed by the Muslims, and in many cases apparently not even plastered over by them until just 2 or 3 centuries ago. In 2020, Hagia Sophia was converted back into a mosque, and the images of the Virgin Mary and Jesus and other Christian heroes, which we'll see inside, were curtained off, not so much because they represent Christians. Jesus and Mary get a lot of respect in the Quran, but because Islam is unfriendly to religious icons in general. While we're inside, we'll hear the hymn or ode Anastasio Simora, sung on Easter morning in the liturgy of the Basilian monks. It's attributed to St. John of Damascus around 700 AD. St. Basil, 4th century contemporary of Jerome, Augustine, and Ambrose in the West, is considered the founder of Eastern communal monasticism. This is another ivory plaque that once decorated a book, and it's thought to represent Justinian's general Belisarius, or perhaps Justinian himself. In any case, it was Belisarius who suppressed the Nike riot, and who in 533 went off to Italy, not so much specifically to rescue Amalasuntha, but to bring Italy back under the control of Constantinople. After dealing with Justinian's interests in North Africa, he finally arrived in Rome in 536. You should remember that Theodoric's daughter and her son had been locked up by Theodahad, and by the time Belisarius arrived in Italy, Theodahad himself had been overthrown by a Goth named Vitiges. Belisarius and his successor Narses made war on Vitiges and his successor Totila, until Narses finally drove the latter out of Ravenna for good in 553, after 20 years of warfare, during which what was left of civilization in Italy was pretty much wrecked. By this time, the population of Rome had fallen to a low of 40,000 from the 1.25 million or so of Trajan's day, and cities as large as Milan had become virtual ghost towns. And Durant says it took Italy until the Renaissance to get over the effects of these Gothic wars, as they're called. Despite all the trouble in Ravenna in the first half of the 6th century, some important buildings were erected, and this is the one which Krautheimer calls, in fact, the only truly great building of the century in Italy. It's the Church of San Vitale. It was probably actually begun in Theodoric's day, but it was apparently mostly built after 540, when Belisarius first occupied the city, though as I said, things didn't really settle down there until after about 553, by which time the church was finished. Like the earlier buildings in the city, it has a plain brick exterior, but was probably just about completely covered with mosaics inside, and those in the presbytery still survive, and they are regarded as among the very finest such things of the age. Here you're looking across the entrance to the presbytery. Above the arches you can see a representation of the three angels who told Abraham that his wife would miraculously give birth, a foreshadowing of the Annunciation and Nativity. This is the kind of thing, remember, that's called a typology. And then there's also a representation of the near sacrifice of Isaac, which is itself viewed as a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Jesus. And on the choir wall you can see the mosaic of Justinian in his court, from which we saw the detail earlier. Here's that group with Justinian up closer now. Justinian was not a priest, let alone a saint, but he was regarded as the head of the church in the East, so he gets to carry the bread for the Mass, and he has a halo. Several of the fellows with him look still less spiritual, notably the former army officer Maximianus, who was made Archbishop of Ravenna after the retaking of it for the Constantinopolitan East, and who's the only identified person in the group. His name is over his head. It is thought by some that Belisarius is the fellow to the immediate left of Justinian. This group has always reminded me, I'm afraid, just a little bit of a mafia family gathering in Palermo. Despite the fact that the emperor was regarded as the de facto head of the church, since he was regarded as the de facto head of everything, the Corpus Juris, his famous law code, does give the Pope spiritual supremacy while reserving the right of the emperor to approve his election, a right never taken very seriously, of course, in Rome, however. The Corpus Juris is always regarded as one of the chief accomplishments of his reign. Mostly it was the work of his Attorney General Tribonian, and it is essentially a compilation of all laws thought valid in addition to some new ones, and it remained a major source of legal precedent in Western Europe as well as the East for well over 1,000 years. We're going to see some more of San Vitale now and hear another piece of music. This is an early Latin version of the Gloria, again from a manuscript that could have originated either in Ravenna or Benevento. Here's Maximianus up closer. The portraits in these mosaics are not only masterpieces in a difficult medium, they're the last real portraits we'll see for more than 500 years. Here's Theodora, the Empress, with her court on the other side of the presbytery. She is, of course, not a priest either, but as Justinian carries the bread, she carries the wine for the Mass. The representations of the women of her court seem less individual, but their gowns, again, are masterpieces in the medium. This is the Lion of St. Mark. More of the decoration here at San Vitale. This is the apse. San Vitale was the first Christian martyred in Ravenna, and he's at the left here being presented with a crown by Jesus. The fellow at the right is Bishop Ecclesias, who was Bishop of Ravenna when the church was begun. Maximianus, whom we just saw, was the Archbishop of Ravenna also when the Church of San Apollinare in Classe was consecrated in 549. San Apollinare was the very first bishop of Ravenna and was buried here where the church is, where there used to be a bustling port called Classe or Classis that has now entirely vanished in the manner of the ports at Ostia and Ephesus. As I mentioned earlier, the body of San Apollinare was moved to what was then the Church of St. Martin within the city, which was then renamed San Apollinare Nuovo, the New, in his honor. Like San Apollinare Nuovo, San Apollinare in Classe here is a basilica with a portico in front, the usual Western style. Here's the nave inside. The mosaics above the arcades are gone, but the apse decoration is at least as impressive as the work at San Vitale. At the very top is Jesus with the four animal symbols of the evangelists, and below that is the main subject, which is the Transfiguration. Here's the apse up closer now. Exactly what happened at the Transfiguration isn't too clear from Scripture. Here the artist has Jesus transformed into the symbol of the faith between Moses and Elijah, who are also present in the biblical account. The three upper sheep there are probably supposed to be Peter, James, and John, also mentioned as present in the Gospels. And below is San Apollinare himself, represented as in paradise, among sheep probably intended to represent the other apostles. Here's the saint himself now. The flowers and birds are nice, but the tree-like bushes look like plants in North Carolina that eat insects. Just as we've seen our last real portraits for over 500 years, this is essentially the end of landscape and art for at least as long a time. Okay, that's where we'll take the break.